Good evening, everybody. How are y'all? Good. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Melinda Maynor Lowry. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of the American South at UNC. And I'm glad to welcome you here for a discussion about how and why racial resegregation in our schools is unfolding before us right now. The center nurtures rigorous scholarship, critical conversations, and creative expressions for a diverse and changing South through the Southern Oral History Program, research grants and fellowships, the journal Southern Cultures, and in our public programming, like tonight, we elevate the stories of Southern communities to serve their futures. We hope you leave here with insights that will inform your own paths through education. I'm grateful to our three panelists and our moderator, whom I'll introduce in a moment, as well as to our event's co-sponsors, the UNC School of Education, the University of North Carolina Press, and of course our host tonight, the Friday Center for Continuing Education. Tonight's program is a chance to bring the past in dialogue with the present. As you may know, Linda Brown, the center of the Brown versus Board of Education case that helped bring about school integration, passed away in March of this year. She was only 9 years old when the Topeka, Kansas board refused to admit her into an all-white school in 1951, and she spent much of her adult life fighting for integration as well. The Topeka school system did not develop a full integration plan until 1993. Linda Brown's family and the U.S. Supreme Court staked a claim that the nation has a vested interest in bringing people together and that public schools in particular serve a common good. Linda Brown's death offers us an opportunity to reflect on where that commitment stands. The experts we'll hear from tonight all offer resources to mark our ability to implement the Supreme Court's principle that separate is inherently unequal in education. Our center comes to this topic through decades of research at the Southern Oral History Program. The SOHP has documented the long civil rights movement through hundreds of interviews in places like Charlotte, North Carolina, Louisville, Kentucky, Memphis, Tennessee, and rural communities throughout the South. These interviews are available online through the program's website, sohp.org. In June, the SOHP is hosting its second K-12 Teachers Institute in collaboration with Carolina Public Humanities. So if you have a teacher in your life or you are one, please apply. We are focusing on using oral history to teach civil rights in the classroom and currently accepting applications, also more information at sohp.org. But we're here tonight to listen and discuss how this national issue relates to Southern schools and to particular schools and school districts in our local communities. In the 1960s, when much of the work for integration took place, the South was leading the way, but we also had the furthest to go. Today, it seems that we are likewise seeing the biggest losses in education equality in this region, and the work of school desegregation is unfinished at best. Segregation by race and class is a growing phenomenon in our home region, with consequences for the success of all students. Our center is dedicated to offering context, evidence, and answers to this type of urgent contemporary issue. Our event is being live streamed tonight, so if you're watching from elsewhere, including Pam's dad, hey, welcome. And anyone can follow our conversation on Twitter as well, so please tweet us at UNC South and use the hashtag #SeparateIsUnequal, which we've helpfully featured on our slide, to participate in our discussion and pose questions. Following our panel, we'll have time for questions from you all, as well as some of the questions we've received on social media as well. You each have, hopefully, a little postcard with you. If you haven't picked one up, they're over here by the microphones. We just pass those out so you can jot some notes or think a little bit about a question that you'd like to pose at the end of the panel. And when you're ready, please just come up to the microphone, and I'll be back up here to recognize and kind of moderate the Q&A. So now allow me to introduce our panelists, and I'll conclude with tonight's moderator, who will then launch our conversation. We've invited 3 education experts whose research addresses a variety of school districts and Southern communities. Historian Pamela Grundy is an author and activist based in Charlotte. She holds her PhD from UNC Chapel Hill and has recently published the book Color and Character, West Charlotte High and the American Struggle Over Educational Equality. She is, which will be featured as the common summer reading we just learned at both Queens College and Davidson College this next summer. She's been publishing books and articles, notably with our center's journal, Southern Cultures, for over 20 years. Jerome Morris is the E. Desmond Lee Endowed Professor of Urban Education in conjunction with St. Louis Public Schools at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. His book, Troubling the Waters, Fulfilling the Promise of Quality Public Schooling for Black Children, is based on research in St. Louis and Atlanta. He's a founder of Education for Liberation, a national coalition of teachers, activists, researchers, parents, and youth. Erica Frankenberg is an associate professor of education at Pennsylvania State University. She's the co-author of Educational Delusions, Why Choice Can Deepen Inequality and How to Make Schools Fair, along with over 50 peer-reviewed articles and 4 co-authored books. She writes for a variety of audiences and has been named a leading influencer of education policy and practice. Finally, our discussion will be moderated by Dr. Carolyn Tyson, professor of sociology at UNC and author of Integration Interrupted, Tracking Black Students and Acting White After Brown, which received the Best Book Award from the American Sociological Association's Sociology in Education section. She's particularly interested in understanding the complex interactions between schooling processes, such as curriculum tracking, and the achievement outcomes of Black students. So as we discuss tonight, please feel free to live tweet our discussion, your thoughts on it, using our hashtag #SeparateIsUnequal. We'll have time for questions and answers after our roundtable, and we'll include any other questions that come in via Twitter as we go. So thank you all very much. Dr. Tyson.
Thank you, Melinda, for the introduction. And welcome, and thanks for joining us tonight for this very important conversation about school resegregation in the South. I'm going to start by asking our panelists to each summarize briefly the trends that you've observed in your research in either national or the local areas that you study. Pamela, why don't we start with you?
All right. Well, thank you very much. It is terrific to be here, and it's wonderful to be back at UNC. Always happy to be here. Go Heels! I also do sports history, so basketball matters a lot to me. The history of West Charlotte High School that I tell in my book, Color and Character, is about several things. It's about what makes a good school, what are the possibilities of school desegregation, and what are the developments that led to resegregation, as well as some of the consequences of resegregation. And being a historian, the trends are long. We'll start back before Brown. Charlotte had a very strong system of segregated schools, particularly in terms of teachers. And if you see up here, I've got slides of some of West Charlotte's teachers and then some of its students during that era. Charlotte was an urban system, paid a supplement, and administrators had their pick of the state's best educators, who also became an integral part of the all-Black, economically diverse communities that surrounded these urban schools. But obviously they were still separate even after Brown, and they were not equal. So in the mid-1960s, a very famous case was filed in Charlotte, the Swan case. And there were 2 fundamental reasons why this case was filed. Vera and Darius Swan, who were the lead plaintiffs, they represented one of these. They wanted their child to go to a mixed school for a variety of reasons. That was very important. They wanted him to go to school with many different kinds of children. Their lawyer, Julius Chambers, really had another priority. He simply did not believe that all the schools would be equal unless they enrolled all enrolled the children of parents whose parents had political power, and at that time that meant white students. He just felt practically it was never going to happen otherwise, and that was one reason he really pushed desegregation. Neither of these views were universally held within Charlotte's African American community. There were a variety of perspectives, but these were the ones that prevailed in the legal arena. And Charlotte ended up with what is really a landmark decision to fully desegregate its schools. After a lot of foot dragging, that did happen. And when it did, West Charlotte High School, historically black school, became a national model of desegregation successes. And it was an extremely successful integrated school. It wasn't perfect, but it was very successful. And one key reason that this is a 1980s picture of West Charlotte students. One key reason was it was able to build on the strengths and the history of West Charlotte's African American communities. Now, this was a big accomplishment because in the 1960s and 70s, the combination of urban renewal, highway construction, and school desegregation had really torn at African American communities in Charlotte and across the country. Neighborhoods were bulldozed, schools were closed, faculties were scattered, and people were scattered. A lot of the supportive community fabric that had built up during the era of segregation was really torn by these many factors. And in fact, in Charlotte, West Charlotte was the only historically African American high school that remained open. But the school supporters were able to save West Charlotte and also to make it clear that its history mattered. And West Charlotte really became an opportunity to showcase the strengths of African American communities and build respect for what they'd accomplished during segregation. When the school became a national model, in fact, many of Charlotte's African Americans were very proud that this celebrated school was a historically black school in a black community. And the whole system becomes a source of pride for all of Charlotte. But even as schools do desegregate, and as African Americans move into positions of prominence in public life in Charlotte, in part because of school desegregation, the same effort doesn't get spread across the entire community, and particularly it doesn't go into integrating housing and building up as all neighborhoods. So as Charlotte booms, this pattern emerges. Well, no, that's not what happens. It doesn't become dark. There we are. It doesn't just go all black. This I have here, this is distribution by race in 1970. The darker, the higher percentage of African Americans. You can see here there's a black area in the center, highly African American. The little white triangle there is West Charlotte High School, but it's kind of spread. This is 1990, 20 years later, and as you can see, there's in fact a greater concentration of African Americans in the center of the city, and these white areas, which are booming suburbs, are now more white than they were in the 70s. Essentially what happens is the inner city remains African American. There's very little investment in that part of town. It is all going out to those suburbs. The inner city also begins to lose its economic diversity because integration worked very well in many cases for more educated African Americans, people who were a little bit better off. And when young black families who were doing a little better, they generally did not move back to the center city. They too went to newer communities being built in the suburbs. And by the late 1980s, there are also a couple of other key developments besides this pattern. There is a new anxiety about schools and test scores and competition. People become very anxious about school, quote unquote, quality. There's also a revived intensity of harsh and inaccurate stereotypes about working class African Americans, which is driven by the war on drugs, by efforts to justify cutting back on public services. And this is the era where you start to get this idea of, quote, super predators or welfare queens, all of these negative stereotypes that are really brought back up and intensified in the 80s and the 90s. So at the start of the 21st century, when a new lawsuit ends Charlotte's busing plan, which had fully desegregated its schools, schools resegregate very quickly. West Charlotte becomes the poorest, the least integrated, and the lowest performing high school in the entire system. What had once been a model is now a struggling school. It continues to have dedicated teachers. It graduates a good number of successful students, but it's a tremendous struggle. Ongoing staff turnover, lots of reform efforts that have been tried and have not worked, and they've been beset by this focus on test scores that's been an utter disaster at high poverty schools across the country. And just to conclude, something that I think is very important, West Charlotte students are very aware of this. They are very aware of the enormous gaps between what is available to them at their school, what's available at wealthy, predominantly white suburban schools. These are differences that go far beyond a test score gap. It's what's available in terms of classes, extracurricular activities, etc. And I want to emphasize that these enormous gaps exist within a single unified system where all schools have similar pure pupil funding. This is not a matter of a struggling inner city and wealthy suburbs that are spending a lot more money. This is within a unified system. And I think that's something that's quite important to talk about. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela. Jerome?
Oh, sorry.
Good evening, everybody. Glad to be here. I know I was introduced as being from St. Louis. I'm a professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, but a lot of my time has been in the South. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. I went to school, including graduate school at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, and I worked for 18 years at the University of Georgia, so it was formative in terms of my thinking and development. But also I look at St. Louis, Missouri as the northwestern part of the South. So it's not just the Midwest. Historically and culturally, it has remnants of the South. And so that's why I'm there to do some of that work around looking at the persistence of segregation in St. Louis. But I want to shift the conversation a little bit. I know we're talking about the resegregation of public schools in the South. I argue, assert, that there's been the continuous segregation of public schools. We've witnessed peaks and valleys. We can go from 1849, 1850, Roberts versus City of Boston court case, to looking at 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson, 1954 Brown versus Board, 1955 Brown 2, and even looking at 2007 parents involved in community schools versus Seattle. We look at these patterns here, we'll see peaks and valleys, but we still see the same thing playing out. For example, 60 years after Brown versus Board of Education, we see that public schools in Cleveland, Mississippi resisted desegregation. 60 years, still had segregated schools. We see that when some forms of desegregation have become implemented in many cities throughout the United States, including southern areas, we'll see these segregated practices and policies emerging that create what looks like racial tracking, academic tracking. And then we try to look at, well, we can go inside of a school and on the surface the school will appear as though it's desegregated. But underneath, you unpeel the layers. You walk into a classroom, you'll see black children in the lower level courses, white children in the higher level courses. And even if you don't see that pattern, you'll see districts create magnet schools in many ways to try to promote desegregation. But at the same time, you'll see white students overwhelmingly represented in magnet schools. You look at AP courses, gifted ed, you can take any type of opportunity or benefit, academic benefit, or anything that creates opportunities. Overwhelmingly, you will see white students benefiting from that. And so a lot of times, I want us to think about the saliency of race or the permanence of racism in this structure. I talked about earlier that I was from Birmingham, Alabama. I graduated in 1986 from a high school, Phillips High School. I was talking to one of our organizers of the session, and she talked about her grandfather, I believe her father, went to the same high school I went to. He's about 90 years of age. The school was an all-white, top-notch public school in the state of Alabama. And Fred Shuttlesworth, I don't know if many of you have heard of him, He fought to try to desegregate that school, Phillips High School, 1957, before Central High School. It didn't make the history books like Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas did. But nevertheless, he was beaten and stabbed while trying to send his children to that school. But I graduated from that school in 1986. And before I graduated, I have 5 older brothers. They went to the school. There were a few white students for a minute, just a minute, in the school when black people could enroll in the school. Quickly, they faded. They moved to the outlying areas, supported by housing policies that reinforce the entrenchedness of segregation, not just in schools, but in housing. And so I say this because the school that I graduated from was 99% black. All of us were on free and reduced lunch, 100%. And so you have this pattern, but this pattern doesn't begin in 1986, 1954, or 2018, in which we're witnessing it. It began 500 years ago. Why do I say 500 years ago? Because it began when the first African was brought to this continent. It began, the formation of the United States was driven by this notion that black people would serve as the fundamental other. And in serving as the fundamental other, it was going to be a situation that black bodies would serve as the startup capital to an economic engine. But black folks did not benefit from it. This system had to have a permanent labor class that became black folks. Initially, I know some people say, well, you know, you have white folks who were indentured servants. I said, yeah, for a small period of time, and it wasn't inherited. So one status as enslaved property, it was inherited. And so I give that historical context to help us understand that where we are today was forged years ago. And where we are today created a pattern of accumulative wealth for some and persistent inequality for others. And it has played out along racial lines. And so I think the thing that is important here is to understand that when we try to have this conversation, when we try to understand how Jim Crowism or segregation can become modified in such a way that perpetuate what we thought we saw in 1896. We see the same thing today, that is really linked to what Du Bois talked about, this notion of whiteness as currency. We have scholars today talking about white privilege or whiteness as property. What it says is that you're going to have these remnants of patterns. So, for example, when you look at the South, let's look across the United States. Let's not just say the South. You know, Malcolm X said, anything south of the Canadian border is the South. So don't get it twisted and think that just these southern states, like I told you, I'm in Missouri, it's very southern. And so we can be in Pennsylvania, it's very southern, okay? So all of America's the South, let's understand that. But so if you look at the rest of the South, called the United States, you'll see 33% poverty level of black children, 10% white children poverty level in terms of public schools. But let's go to the deep South, Alabama, 42%. White students, 11%. These are public school students. Look at Mississippi, similar, right? Louisiana, similar. And so we have this persistence that's playing out. And so now the historical piece is important, understanding who has wealth, who doesn't have wealth. So let's look at this here. You see this graph depicting this notion that we can reform society, we can restructure society by changing children's beliefs and prejudices, eradicating that, and using schools as the means to do that. However, we never really paid attention to the segregation that emanated from housing. Why? Because nobody wanted to mess with anybody's property. No one wanted to upset the value of white currency, okay? So we see these patterns, and what I want to do, I've alluded to earlier about this notion of whiteness as currency. Let me just illustrate. When I was in Birmingham in 1985, I was talking to a young scholar here, Michio. Where are you, Michio? Are you in the audience? Right, she's doing some work around the South in New Orleans around historical understanding of educational inequality in New Orleans. And one of the things I was just telling her that I had gone to Japan, we're just striking up a conversation. I had gone to Japan while in high school. In Birmingham, 90% black school district. In its efforts to try to symbolically get beyond that past, selected 4 students to go to Japan. I was the beneficiary of that. 2 black students and 2 white students. If we really were for equality and equity, they would have selected 9 black students and 1 white student. The school district was 90% black. And so the other thing I want to do is, let me get back to this here. Here's another illustration in terms of gifted education. I'm about to finish up, Carolyn. Gifted education. I want you to look at this here. This is a school district that I'm studying at Atlanta, Georgia. I studied a colleague, Terry Grantham. He was partnering with me on this. His work is in gifted education. But just to illustrate whiteness as currency and whiteness as property, if you can see that the school district is about 75% black. Do you see that? 75% black. What percent black do you see white student, percent white? About 10% white. And look over and you see white students making up what? About 30+% of students in gifted ed. Overrepresentation of 269%. Now I want you to look at black students in a predominantly black school district, underrepresented by 34%. What does that say? It says that no matter how we configure it, that we have to think about what happens within schools and how these patterns become modified in such a way that it reinforces where we were back in 1896. And so I'll talk a little bit more about where do we go from here and how we can try to address some of these issues in spite of what we have and focus, what I would argue, on quality education in addition to trying to eradicate legalized segregation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerome. Eric?
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, particularly as Melinda reminded us in the aftermath of Linda Brown's death. I have often thought, growing up in the South myself, I feel to be a beneficiary of the work that Linda Brown and her parents did. In fact, so much so that I named my son after her father, Oliver Brown. Just immensely impressed with the courage to which they tried to get our nation to live up to our better ideals. And we've seen the past 60+ years, the struggle it has been to live up to those ideals that they inspired. I want to briefly touch on some of my research that talks about the overall patterns of segregation, and then highlight 3 reasons why I think we are where we are right now. Like Jerome, I am also a native of the South, of Alabama, in fact. The other end of the state, Mobile, Alabama. And it helps, actually, that Jerome mentioned his experience in Birmingham, which was a municipal district in Jefferson County, Alabama, and I'll get to that in a little while. I grew up in Mobile County, which was a countywide school district at the time, and so there were 100 schools in my countywide district. I, too, went to one of the first schools that was integrated in Alabama, 1963, over the fierce objection of George Wallace. And in my senior year of high school, 1997, the court case was dismissed. Our district was declared unitary, or said that segregation ended. My high school was actually the only one in the county that was well integrated. It was about 50% white and 50% black, although, of course, tracking within it. But there was a school a mile away from mine that was almost entirely black and had no AP courses. We could hear our marching bands when we were on the field together. It was that close. And so these questions of how this inequality could exist, and yet the court said that that was fine, ignited these questions that continue to fuel my research. And so that gets to the first point as to why, as I very proudly told audiences across the North, that the South actually had been the most desegregated until very recently, when I was told repeatedly that segregation was a Southern problem. In fact, the court orders that were in place, along with pressure from the Lyndon Johnson administration through the Office of Civil Rights after the Civil Rights Act was passed, brought widespread desegregation to the South for black and white students. We have seen the rapid ending of hundreds of desegregation cases, particularly across the southern region, and that is why we're seeing the rapid declines in desegregation today. In fact, some research has even shown that the declines in desegregation are causally related to the ending of these court desegregation orders. So I think it's important to highlight the way in which that has driven both the desegregation and then resegregation. But again, these have been very fiercely contested. The district I grew up in certainly not only had leaders that fiercely tried to resist full widespread desegregation, but then they named schools after them. The Magnet Middle School I went to was named after the totally racist superintendent who tried to permit widespread desegregation. So some really lasting legacies there. The second reason that I want us to talk a little bit about, and I'll get into it later, is these issues of boundaries and choice as we have reframed how we think about public education. So boundaries, I mean boundaries both between and within school districts. We sometimes think of boundaries as things ordained by God almost. You know, how could you possibly change a boundary? Boundaries are set by political processes and therefore can be changed by political processes. And we have seen a lot of these processes playing out across this region. In a few minutes, I'll talk about some of these more in depth, but just to highlight, secession is a growing challenge, particularly in the South, because the South, unlike the northern southern states that Jerome talked about, the South actually had larger county-wide school districts. I'm in Pennsylvania now and has 500 school districts. I say, what do you think about county-wide school districts? And my students sometimes think that, why would you ever organize schools on a county-wide basis? So the South did have that jurisdictional advantage, and secession is now rapidly threatening that. And for just an example of what that looks like, this is the Memphis area. The lowest map right here shows the proliferation of secession in 2014, 6 suburban districts along with a district that's kind of everything that was left over from the county. So that's what I mean when I talk about district boundary secession. But there's also boundaries within school districts. And I think particularly in diverse districts, perhaps you can think of suburban districts, certainly in Metro Atlanta, other places, I think that there is increasing pressure on school boards to draw boundary lines in such a way to try to hold on to white or more advantaged families because there's a fear of losing these families to private schools, to charter schools, and other forms of choice to move to outlying suburban districts. And so thinking about the ways that these boundaries are manipulated and exacerbating segregation is something that I think is really important for us to think critically about because they have such important implications for what goes on in the schools. Another form of this choice, so boundaries are in essence a form of residential choice, what schools associated with the house that you buy. And certainly a lot of people particularly talk about white schools when they live in a neighborhood with a predominantly white school when they sell their house. They don't do that when you sell your house in a largely black or low-income neighborhood. So that housing school dynamic is really important. There certainly is the rise of charter schools. They can be both segregated white schools or segregated students of color, and they can also have really pernicious effects, particularly in a lot of southern rural communities. We're seeing the rise of charter schools that are endangering long-standing desegregation efforts, even under court order in the South. And we have also a marked rise in private schools in the South. It's actually the fastest growing region in terms of the number of private schools, and they are disproportionately enrolling white students in this region. So that's another thing for us to think about. And then the last thing to talk about is how we talk about schools. So we are I think since 2016, we don't quite believe in post-racialism as much as we did. But we certainly have seen this rise of race neutrality in how we talk about things that have racial effects. And so certainly we've seen this in the courts. Chief Justice Roberts in the Parents Involved decision, although Sonia Sotomayor has very strongly challenged it in more recent education decisions, that we need to talk about race if we're going to get rid of the effects of racial discrimination. But we see, for example, when we talk about local control or we talk about open enrollment, these are terms that sound race neutral. How can you be against local control? And so I've started asking people to tell me what you mean by local control, because it's almost this reflex to talk about decisions that are being made. But the strength of it is really aided by this growing colorblindness, that we're not talking about the racial effects of these ways that we think about schooling, and then also the competitive, narrow framing of education as a private good for my child instead of thinking about the larger community. And that also gives very powerful resonance to talking about these race-neutral ways of structuring schooling. So I'll get into this more in a little while, but those are some things I'm thinking about right now.
Okay, thank you. So you all have talked about, you've incorporated in your discussion of the trends a little bit of why this is happening. And I want to turn now to thinking about, so what? What are the consequences of the trends that you've talked about in Charlotte and in other places in the resegregation? Why should we care about this?
Well, I'll say, I mean, in Charlotte, I think that we should care because you see these profound inequalities that exist when resegregation happens, again, within a single school district. I mean, it's quite clear the way that community resources affect a school in so many ways. And if you have such disparate communities, if you have very wealthy communities, and as you said, it ties all into not just what's happening with the school, but what's happening in the broader communities with housing and such. If you have these tremendous differences in neighborhoods and communities within a district, and you have neighborhood schools which then do reflect their communities, then you're going to have tremendous disparities in those schools, which is what we see here, what we see now in Charlotte. It's something that everything needs to be worked on, but you don't want the schools to be magnifying the inequalities that already exist, which unfortunately is what is the case in Charlotte right now.
Yes, I think that one of the things, like what now, I think we have to think about is that I'm also doing some research in St. Louis, and we're seeing the phasing out, or they call it phasing out, or extension, but it still means ending of a desegregation plan there. And I believe that parents, particularly parents who don't have options, who are poor, need to have these options in terms of their children should have the option to be able to attend schools that provide some semblance of quality for them, that which they generally don't receive in areas that are extremely poor. But also as we do that, I think we also have to think about the quality of schooling, and we have to think about what type of experience do those children have in those settings. So as we have this conversation around desegregation, we also need to think about the role of black educators in that. And quite often we know there have been a number of, I'm sure all of you have seen that, the benefit of having just one black teacher and how that makes a difference in terms of black students' achievement. And that's something that we've not had in this conversation. Students have been desegregated, but there's been no concurrent effort to try to increase the numbers of black educators or educators of color in the process, even if we understand the sociological patterns, such as black folks who normally would have considered education going to other professions. We still have to make that part of our conversation. So what it means is that as this is playing out, as an African American, for me, I know there'll always be these peaks and valleys, so I don't treat it as something that's, oh, let me get scared right now. The way I interpret it is that things change and things go back and forth. I was happy when Obama was elected, but then how do I feel when Trump gets elected? You know, I just have to keep my cool and all that. So the point, though, I want to say is that no matter what, I think we have to think about making sure that black children are equipped. And I center my work around black people because what I'm trying to do, as we have these conversations, period, I'm always interested in ensuring that black folks don't are not placed on the margins in this conversation as we try to work toward the common good. That we make sure that black children are not decentered in the conversation. And I always ask, well, are we preparing these children with certain skills? Are we helping them not to just be comparable or competitive with white children, but thinking beyond the United States. For me, I think that becomes essential, because if we pay attention to the least of these, those who have been historically at the bottom, I think the society as a whole is much better. And I think that's the way we need to think about it.
I wanted to zoom in a little bit more to think about what this looks like on the ground. And I've spent the past several years studying a couple of different metropolitan areas. Memphis, you see up here. Memphis was actually initially, we started studying it because it was an example of the biggest consolidation in history. In 2010, after the Tea Party election, the overwhelmingly black Memphis School Board voted to surrender its charter to the school district to be absorbed by the countywide district because it was worried about funding. And it would lose the funding from the suburban areas. And so immediately after that, however, the 6 suburban municipalities went to the state, and though they called it local control, it was actually state allowed local control. They were allowed to vote. And so before there was even the first day of the merged school district, the suburban districts had already voted to secede from the school district. And so what does that mean when we think about what that looks like on the ground? That means that we have radically different school districts. So at the top was the city of Memphis and the suburban Shelby County in the year before the merger occurred. You had 81% of Memphis city schools were black students. Half of the Shelby County was white. So those were pretty disparate districts, obviously very different poverty rates as well. You had a 1 year of the merged district. The Achievement School District is this kind of portfolio district of charter schools coming online in Tennessee, which is overwhelmingly African American and low income as well. And you see the merged district was only 20% white. I think that overall, the fact that whites were such a low percentage is part of the key reason that motivated this demerger or secession. I suspect if it had been a consolidation that had a higher white percentage, I wonder if the same secession would have animated what happened in Memphis. And then the following year, you see the proliferation of different school districts. So in the guise of local control and efficiency, you actually have 7 superintendents instead of just 1. And you have vastly different racial composition because there is limited assignment across school district lines. What basically happened is that these school district lines were now fixing the racial composition and the socioeconomic composition as well in these school districts. And so local control was a way for these residents to preserve and accumulate advantages. And so we went and tried to understand why did they decide to do this. Ended up talking to a lot of suburban community members, and and what was interesting is that this wasn't necessarily led by those who had children in the public schools. This was by grandparents, people who were really talking about community economic development and housing values, but seeing it as a way of preserving and accumulating advantage for their local community versus the larger community, even as they said, that they benefited from the larger Memphis community in terms of the great resources that were in the city of Memphis. And so I think when we think about what happens as a result of these changes that we're talking about, we have to think certainly what's going on in the schools is critically important. The not having access to a desegregated teaching force, which was one of the factors that desegregating districts had to attend to, was really important. But I think it's also really important to think about how families are using those differences in accumulation of wealth to further where they can live. So Germantown is this district that's 73% white. It is right next to Memphis. It is adjacent to it. And yet the median income there is 3 times as high as in Memphis. So those boundary lines have really powerful meanings that they're sending to home seekers. And they're able to justify it by saying, I can afford to do this. It's my right to be able to just send my children to these schools and not let those children in. And so the way that we talk about it as a private right and a way of accumulating resources for those who look like us, or however we narrowly define it, has really pervasive effects both for the schools and the inequality in terms of the resources going to them, but also the communities as well. I also want to show one other example from Jerome's home area. This is Jefferson County, Alabama. I ran out of colors to use to show all of the different school districts that are now in Jefferson County, Alabama. There are now a dozen school districts. The white yellow in there is the city of Birmingham. There's this group here that's along the southeast corridor. There's a over the mountains suburban, very affluent districts. These over to the west are those that are typically more African American and low income families. You also see the boundaries even are so jagged. And so these are, again, really fascinating ways in which they're trying to divide people. What is really fascinating about this district versus Memphis is that Jefferson County, Alabama is still under a court desegregation order that began in 1965. And so you may have heard about Gardendale, Alabama, the overwhelmingly white community that has been trying to secede since 2012 from the Jefferson County School District. They said, not unfairly, that lots of other districts had been able to do so in the past. Leeds did so, Tarrant, Trussville, Trussville and Leeds did it since 2000. But for this case, a famous former judge stepped in and challenged it and said, we need to really look at the effect that this is going to have on Jefferson County. And that effect is pretty powerful. So since 1965, 7 different districts have formed have left the countywide school district. Technically, none of this should happen if it's going to have an adverse impact on desegregation. And you can see by this blue dotted line that if those students were still in the countywide school district, it would have a white percentage that's 10 percentage points higher than what it is today. It would be majority white instead of majority non-white. And so the judge in the case stepped in and said, for a bunch of different reasons, but including the effect it would have on Jefferson County, Alabama, that they would not permit Gardendale to form its own separate school district. We can talk more about that case. I think it's a really important case, though, for me, because it's the only time in which we've had a judge in these recent rash of secessions step in, consider the evidence, and write a 150-page decision that actually made no one happy initially, but at least considered the evidence for school desegregation. And I think we're not seeing an impartial type of body that is able to do that in many communities around the South. But I think it's a model that we really need to think about how we do it through our political structures to begin with.
Can I just, we only have 10 minutes left, and I have 2 other questions I'd like to have you address. So one is about how are communities and districts responding to this, right? And so whether it is communities of color, how they're responding to the resegregation, or white communities, or school leaders, district leaders, how are they responding to these trends that you've described?
Well, if you want to go ahead, so we don't. I'm not first all the time.
Yeah, one of the things I want to say is that I did research in Atlanta, Georgia, in a suburban district there, and one of the things is that at one point the district was predominantly white, suburban, and so we saw this pattern, demographic shifts into suburbs, and white people moving into the city. So we see these shifts, and these shifts are bringing new challenges, particularly poor people who are moving into the suburban area, overwhelmingly black. And so the way people are responding is that one of the things that many people are just thinking, many of them are not at times thinking politically about what's happening. And it's just, they're kind of attributing it to demographic shifts. And by seeing it as a demographic shift rather than a political pattern, then the activism or the consciousness or just making sure that they're addressing it the way people went to war when we saw, in terms of with Linda Brown and Brown versus Board of Education case, how pivotal that was in terms of our national consciousness. People are not dealing with it like that. It's just kind of business as usual. But one of the things we're seeing, though, is I still want to get back to the economic piece. And that economic piece is that you still see these patterns, these racial patterns, correlated with the economic patterns in the sense that black people are disproportionately poor. And when you have poverty along with African American people who are at the bottom historically, then you see these outcomes. And so you're going to see such outcomes that are reflective of racial, it looks like segregation patterns. And then people at times begin to attribute these outcomes to race and not understanding how they're so inextricably linked to the social class piece. So what I'm saying is that I don't think people are responding enough.
Okay.
That's what.
And I think, I mean, that really speaks to Charlotte. Leaders of Charlotte aren't real happy right now because Charlotte's not looking that good. I mean, we're coming out at the bottom of lots of measures of social equality, economic mobility, and this is troubling to the leaders of Charlotte. But I think the question becomes whether they are going to be willing to take the significant steps that will be required to really make some changes in these housing patterns, in these economic patterns. Charlotte had been willing to desegregate its schools, to use public power to do that, much less willing to tamper with what was considered the marketplace, even though a lot of that was also federally and public policy driven in terms of housing and that sort of thing. But I think right now, I see a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of, oh, we have to figure out how to do something, but not a lot of willingness to say, well, we're going to just step up and figure out, and people are maybe going to have to give some things up, or we're going to have to really see some significant shifts. And I don't think the hand-wringing is just crocodile tears. I mean, I think people in Charlotte are genuinely troubled, but that not necessarily troubled enough to make the significant steps that would be required to make a real difference.
I see three quick groups. One, people who are in complete denial or are doing things that are actively trying to preserve and exacerbate segregation and inequality. Second, I see groups like what you're talking about that are implementing what I call non-comprehensive responses. So they are adopting a few, some maybe symbolic policies that are going to address a little bit of the issue, but largely are going to leave it untapped, in part because of these race-neutral policies. And then I see this very smaller group, but third group that understand the benefits of integration for schools and communities and are trying to figure out what to do in an era that is politically and legally against what they're trying to do. And so they are trying, given the parents involved decision, the ending of court orders, trying to figure out what they can do given really high levels of residential segregation. And we had a brief period in which I thought the federal government in 2016 was trying to support them, and those supports obviously are not there right now.
So that leads me to this final question about what can people do, whether communities, whether education leaders, district leaders, what can people do?
Well, one of the things I think that has to happen, again, I'm going to stick with this focus on quality education. One of the things that I think has to occur is that we've seen these patterns, for example, as I mentioned, the Atlanta model, and we're seeing that in St. Louis also, is that you have gentrification that is taking place in many of these areas. And I see it throughout. And so you have these patterns of housing patterns that are reinforcing some of these segregation patterns. And I think one of the things that has to occur is that we have to deal with the housing conversation. We have to think about the community conversation. One of the things that as we approach or as we think about creating quality education within schools, even in schools that are still going to be predominantly black, we have to think about how do we ensure that the communities around these schools are also viable. So how do we do that? And so part of the conversation that we have about creating quality education, creating integrated education, it has to be also about how do we create communities that reflect the kind of schools that we want. So that, for example, if I were to ask people, you know, and you can say, well, I went to an integrated school, my question then would be, where do you live? Where do you live? And so if the question is, oh, I live in an all black and all white neighborhood, then we know there are some issues with that. So what I think we have to do is think about how do we strengthen communities, particularly historically disadvantaged communities. And then sometimes we heard of the Marshall Plan. Remember that in terms of World War II. I think communities need that. We have this conversation now about schools as being anchors in communities. We know that schools help communities become better, and we know communities likewise help schools become better. But I've argued in my book, Trouble in the Waters, that we need to create what I call communally bonded schools. And what do I mean communally bonded schools? If you look at the history of predominantly black schools, we see that there is evidence that some black schools historically were doing extremely well in terms of educating black children. A lot of times that was just thrown out. People didn't care, and Vanessa Siddle Walker has captured that in her book of Hyde County, North Carolina, or Caswell County Training School, I believe. So when she talked about in their highest potential, that you had a school that was performing better than the white school, but still was closed down. And so my point is that there are some elements, even in the schools that I've studied in St. Louis, in Atlanta, Georgia, I was able to find that there were predominantly black schools in those respective cities that outperformed, this is between 1995 and 2002, that outperformed the white schools in the city. There's one particularly in St. Louis that I call Fairmont Elementary School, outperforms students even in the magnet schools. It's struggling now because the community has increasingly become poor. You know, so what I'm saying is that we have to understand that all that was there during segregation for black people was not bad. The relationships that black people had, the black teachers had with black children, that black communities had with black schools, was more symbiotic. It was not like a parent-school relationship. I call it communal. And so we need to rekindle some of that as we also think about strengthening communities. And we have to do it in a way that in many ways restores black people in a way that would be a radical proposal. And I'm willing for us to have that kind of conversation, even if it's not politically feasible or people think we shouldn't have that conversation. I think we have to have it despite what many white people in America would say. It's necessary.
Well, and I think, I mean, in talking about gentrification, I mean, again, looking particularly at West Charlotte High, that's an area that's now gentrifying. There's a lot of people moving in, and one of the questions becomes, I mean, number one, if folks are moving in, there are young families moving into this area. Number one, how do you make it possible? It's not bad to have an influx of more resources, which is communities have needed more development. On the other hand, how do you make it possible for the people who are living there now to stay there? And how can you create schools that, if these communities are diversifying economically and to some degree racially as well, how do we create schools that will actually bring together all of these children? You actually do have a possibility, I think, for creating some more naturally integrated schools as a part of this, if you can keep the people who are living there, find ways, which is very difficult. It's one of the things that Charlotte is wringing its hands over without necessarily a lot of success. But the problem, as you say, with charters, with other kinds of things, you could very easily have an integrated community and segregated schools, because people who have resources, who have abilities, who have time to search out, move into the neighborhood, but don't send their kid to the local school. And so you end up with, you don't end up improving the school, you don't end up making any changes, you just end up with people living side by side. So I think there's real potential there, but it's potential that is going to take a lot of work, both in communities, at civic levels, and within schools, if you're going to create schools that work for everybody.
Okay. And briefly, I think we have to think about both short-term and long-term strategies. I think in the short term, certainly if we can try to harness these demographic changes, though the preliminary evidence I've seen shows that these white students aren't enrolling in the neighborhood schools. And so how do we do that? How do we change how we talk about education, the goals of it? How do we harness choice? And this is some of the work that I've done with Gary Orfield to think about restructuring choice to be integrative and not, as it typically is, market force and segregative. We have to think about what happens within schools as well so that it's a good community for white students and students of color. But I think we have to really also, while we can think about how do we tinker around the edges to make what's going on better now, we have to think about how to support district leaders and parents who want to do the right thing in terms of integration. I think it's hard sometimes, both for parents and for some district educators, to create integration. So how can we support them connect across different communities? How can we also really shift a long-term strategy in how we think about schooling, challenge race neutrality and colorblindness, because we need public support that I think will then also then shift how our political leaders and how our legal system thinks about integration as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Melinda now, who is going to now take questions from Twitter, other social media, and our audience to our panelists.
Amazing insights we've heard, and my thumbs are kind of numb from tweeting. So if somebody can tweet the Q&A, we'll keep that conversation going. It's actually, y'all can't see it, but it's really kind of popping right now. So if you all have some questions, please do gravitate towards our microphones on either side of the room so we can make sure that they're recorded for our live stream audience and for the video that will be on our Center's YouTube channel in a few weeks. I would like to start perhaps with a question that was submitted yesterday, actually, on Twitter. We've been taking this, keeping this going for a few days. From Deirdre Houchin, I believe in Florida. Jerome, this gets back to something you mentioned early in our conversation. She asked, how do we interpret Du Bois's "Does the Negro need separate schools" in this time of resegregation? You kind of come back with this.
Okay, yes, and continuing that, Du Bois said the Negro needs neither separate schools or mixed schools. What he needs is education. And I think that's the important piece of that quote, and that is that there's no magic, as he says, in either mixed schools or in separate schools. A mixed school with teachers who care little about black children is bad. But a black school, a segregated school that's lacking resources and just has ignorant placeholders, as he called it, is equally bad. And so he said the natural thing is that all children need to be educated in an integrated setting, period. That helps black folks to remove the inferiority complex. It provides a lot of things. But in this case, in many ways, in what we're seeing today, is not as possible as we would like it to be. So I like to kind of think about Barbara Sizemore. Any of you familiar with Barbara Sizemore? She was an educator, one of the first black urban school leaders, female urban school leaders. And one of the things she would tell black people, she said, black folks just don't get it. And what she's saying is that even as we strive to try to participate and to try to integrate, even with the onus of of making these changes on black people, white people really pull away because there's something economically beneficial to not being around black folks. I don't take it personally anymore. I understand it as a racial realism, and that is, I strive to make sure that my children, I want them to be in an integrated setting and a diverse setting, but I understand that it's incumbent upon me and families that I know to ensure that these children have the skills, that they have black educators. And so I make sure that they have that. And I insist in school structures that they're going to get that. And if it doesn't, we make sure we provide it. So my point is that I think we're in an era right now, as we look at these persistent achievement gaps, when you look at it critically, Carolyn, in terms of your work, you noted in terms of North Carolina schools that when you had these segregation, when you had diversity in schools and you had black children who were at the bottom and then you had a few black children became the beneficiaries, that there was so much animosity toward those few black children that some folks said they're acting white, right? And I think we don't need that type of pattern playing out either. And so I'm like Du Bois, the new Du Bois, who said, we don't need to create a talented tent or create an opportunity for a few token black people. We need to make sure that the guiding 100, as my colleague Dr. Derek Ulrich, who's now at the University of Virginia, talks about, that Du Bois asserted that we need to ensure that all black children, not just a few who benefited from the integrated setting, are the ones, well, again, the ones who are the beneficiaries. So going back to Du Bois, like building on that, yes, he would argue, I even think in today's time, that we need to focus on quality education. But that's very challenging. It's very challenging. I don't have all the answers for that.
It sounds like we have lots of evidence assembled to argue that when you focus on quality education for African American children, you're elevating the quality of education for all children.
You're elevating the quality for all children.
For all children. So,
right.
You know, when you think about that particular framework or focus, it's less about racial divisions and hierarchies and how they're structured into the system, and more about, is everybody getting a good education?
Right.
And what do we mean by that?
That's another question.
That's the part you can't solve necessarily.
Melinda, can I just jump in real quickly? Sure. One of the things that was largely overlooked during the Obama administration is that the Department of Justice came in and reinvigorated a lot of the existing court orders that had gone dormant for decades that some districts didn't even know were there. And one of the key aspects they brought in is this notion of quality of education. So they looked at students and teachers and faculty, but they also wanted to see, are they having opportunities that are equivalent? And so they looked at discipline, and they looked at gifted. And so looking at a lot of these different ways of thinking about what desegregation in the 21st century is, not just getting inside the school door, but what happens once you're inside there. And I think that's a really important thing that didn't always happen in the earlier generation, and a key thing that if we can keep those court orders in place could help the region.
Well, and I think also, I mean, it gets to one of the problems or the challenges you get with segregation is this idea that, well, there's this group of kids and they need this, and then there's this group of kids and they're different and they need something different, and then the idea that, and what is often happens with segregation is you end up with the low-income kids of color needing just the basics and all of this pushing on the basics, and they don't need all that other stuff, which is part of why you get this focus on testing and all this. But again, if the focus is on all children need this broad and rich education, then, and you make sure that the children who are least, at this point, least access to that actually get it, then in fact, if you put that broad, rich education everywhere, then everybody will benefit, just as in some ways all schools have suffered from this test score focus. I think the more struggling schools more so than the wealthier schools, but they've suffered, you know, this focus, it's gone through the system. If we could really turn toward this broad, deep, rich education to make sure everybody has it, I think that everybody would benefit.
Thank you. Let's start here. If you'd introduce yourself briefly also.
Sure. I'm Jerma Jackson, and I actually want to first thank you for great presentations, very different perspectives on education and resegregation and desegregation and segregation. But one of the things that's striking to me is how economics always comes up in everybody's presentation. The economics always comes up. So my question, I wanted to just kind of double down on Carolyn's question about consequences. What are the consequences? And my question is, when we think about the relationships, and I will make this plural, between education and economics, my question is, are we witnessing the undermining of publicly financed education?
Absolutely. I think that we can't talk about trying to pursue desegregated public schooling if we don't believe in public schooling. And so we have to first believe in schooling as a public good. And that certainly seems to be under attack right now. And I think there's no coincidence that that is happening at a time in which we now have a majority, we're tipping towards a majority of students of color in our public schools. And so if we don't believe in it as a public good that everyone has a right to, which is not in the federal constitution technically as it's been interpreted right now, but is in every state constitution, then it's easy to frame that this is just for the people who are lucky enough to live in this community. The gaps, the racial differences in exposure to poverty are actually one of the primary things driving the achievement gap. And so I think this is a really important thing for us to think about carefully.
Thank you. Let's go to this side.
Hi there. Can you all hear me? Yes, now I'm in the mic. My name is Becca Fisher. I'm a first year at UNC School of Law here. I worked in education in Charlotte for 2 years before coming to law school. I worked in West Meck and West Charlotte high schools. I'm curious if any of you have done research into this overwhelming trend of disciplinary reassignment in alternative schools as ways to push students of color out of public schools, and those trends sort of lining up with what we've been talking about as the achievement gap being so clearly disproportionate to students of color.
Not that I've done research directly. I mean, one of the things we see that even in pre-K kindergarten, we see that black children are overwhelmingly being suspended, expelled from schools. And so we see that pattern playing out, and in many ways leading to the school to prison pipeline. And so in terms of school districts, yeah, that becomes one of the practices that appears to be unintended. That in the end, when we look at these patterns, we see that it's paralleling what we're witnessing in terms of incarceration and also placing in special education too. So yes, we see these here, but not that I've done direct research related to that, but I can generally, I think a lot of the public is increasingly becoming familiar with the disciplinary practices that are going on as a way to ensure that white parents don't pull their children out. So some of it is related to that too. And I did some research in Cincinnati years ago in which we looked at, and a lot of, I just want you to know that my perspective, you know, I try to, again, have a realistic approach to where I'm thinking about it. But we saw that even in schools that were more desegregated, like magnet schools, we saw higher disciplinary practices toward black children, that black children were more likely to be suspended in schools that were more desegregated. And so when you look at, and I think some of it is, it's kind of like when we're witnessing in terms of U.S. society, why are we to divorce what goes on in schools from what goes on in society? If a white person is walking down the street and there's a white male just walking, it's not an issue, but if a black male is walking down the street, people they tense up, or police would want to pull that person over like they arrested those two men at Starbucks, you know. And so my point is that a lot of what we're witnessing in school is we shouldn't disconnect it from these patterns we see in societies. Educators, school district leaders are not immune from what goes on, or their thinking is not disconnected from what plays out in the broader society.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a broader issue in terms of perceptions, in terms of what people do. In Charlotte, they recently had, you may have seen a study of discipline that showed that if you looked at the disciplinary measures for which there was a very clear, you know, you do this, you know, then this consequence comes down, there actually wasn't a big difference between African Americans and white kids. But when it was it's somebody's perception that you've done something that's not appropriate, but it's subjective, that's where you saw the big heavily disproportionate black, particularly young men of color, being disciplined. So schools reflect our society, and we have to work on all of that.
Thank you. Let's go over here. Thank you.
Hi. I just want to first say, I applaud all of you guys because my passion and goal is inner city education. I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. And it's really crazy how you have the county and the city and how much these disparities are so large. I mean, I didn't have air conditioning in my school, but as for the city, they didn't even have heat. They didn't even have chairs, teachers that even cared about their education. So I'm more focused on inner cities, especially in the north. So seeing this in the south has really opened my eyes. One of the questions I have is about inner city education. So do you guys believe that, with the case of San Antonio versus Rodriguez, I don't know if you guys are very familiar with that case, they said that education is not a fundamental right under the Constitution. So do you believe that we may get another case again in the Supreme Court that may change this resegregation in the South, or some sort of push or movement to go to the Supreme Court justices in order to push this forward?
Sure. I think there's some really interesting legal theories that I've seen that have been that are being developed right now to argue that, in fact, under the Civil War amendments to the Constitution, that it was thought that Congress, of course, intended that public education was a right. So Derek Black just published an article in the Stanford Law Review about that, and some of the cases percolating right now, in particular the one out of Detroit, Michigan, of course, another deeply segregated, urban, impoverished city district that is that way because of the Supreme Court's Milliken decision in 1974. It's trying to argue that the lack of literacy for the black children in Detroit is abridging their rights under the federal Constitution. And so I think there are a couple of cases like that that are certainly in the lower courts, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I do really, and I'm sorry, I know that there's the former dean of the law school here. I'm sorry, Jack. But I think it's not just the law that has to change. The law reflects our society as well, just like schools do. And if we shift the way we think about schools and rights and race and public education, then that can also help edge the courts along too.
Thank you. We have about just 10, 15 minutes left, so I want to make sure we get all of our questions in and maybe a few more from online.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I think especially looking at the connection with economics, and when we recognize the value of what we refer to as 21st century skills when it comes to education, I think more and more people are understanding that diversity of experience is a value and is economically valued as well. And I'm wondering if you're aware of any schools in the nation that are getting this diversity thing right, that are showing an example of how you create an environment where all students thrive, where everyone would want to send their kids there.
I don't know of any. Okay, maybe somebody. I saw at certain periods. You mean that have high quality education along with integrated education?
Yes.
No institution is perfect. Certainly I'm always asked this question, like, what are some good things? And I'm always hesitant because then, of course, no district or school can do anything perfectly. I do think there are schools and districts that understand the premise of your question and are striving to do that while also still contending with pretty powerful political countervailing winds. So there are school districts that have tried to marry housing and school integration efforts. Oak Park outside of Illinois, though they certainly still have within school segregation issues as well. Louisville, Kentucky has tried valiantly after the school district the Supreme Court struck down their plan to institute countywide school desegregation. They face a real challenging state political climate. Berkeley, California, I know everyone says, oh, that's Berkeley, but they have a really interesting integration plan. You know, there are still gaps within any of these, so.
Well, I mean, it can be done. There are schools that are integrated and that are high quality, but they're here and there, and they arise and they go away. I mean, if it's done right, like West Charlotte was during desegregation, it can be, I mean, again, not perfect, but a lot of good can happen. But I think, again, the challenge is getting it not for the 10%, but for the 100%. I mean, that is, or just getting the quality schooling, that's the point that people are falling on. But I mean, it can be done. There are some really wonderful schools.
I think increasingly you have to think about metropolitan-wide districts. Yes. Like there are areas that, like in the St. Louis area, tons of separate districts, entities. And so it's been averse to creating like a county-wide metropolitan district that would have a greater sense, would demonstrate greater equity, I feel. And so I think we need to strive a little bit more for that. You're not going to get all that you deserve in that type of configuration, but you still won't exacerbate these patterns that we're witnessing. And so some of it is the way in which everybody is thinking locally. Like the St. Louis area, everybody loves their local school, local community, because, you know, it perpetuates these patterns. And so we know that certain areas don't even, in fact, it makes economic sense to bring these districts together. But a lot of people kind of are going against the logic of that. And that's amazing in terms of the rationale, the thinking, the way in which people are embracing. So there are economic benefits to consolidating.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations. They were really wonderful. My name is Brittany Murray. I am studying parents and the ways that they work collectively to reinforce or exacerbate patterns of inequality in school. And I'm really interested in, historically, the role of parent associations in working to push back against some of the efforts to desegregate or even work toward putting some of these school districts in secession. And I'm really interested in your comment, Dr. Frankenberg, about the role of grandparents and kind of working maybe through other avenues, whether it be like city council, to influence the district or the city in other ways.
Yeah, that was something I didn't expect. I am actually about to be the parent of a kindergartner, so I maybe am giving undue weight to parents right now, and I have really thought that certainly in this growing constellation of choices, the kind of choices that parents make on a micro level are really important. And I do think in particular we're placing too much stress on mothers who have a variety of both resources and constraints. And so how we think about doing that and making it easier is important. But this notion of the role of grandparents, who of course would have been parents at a time in which maybe desegregation was uneven, and maybe they were part of the resistance, I think is something that we don't think about because we think it's parents who are driving this. And so until we really think about the wealth and resource aspects of this, I think we are probably not going to be fully effective in countering the push for inequality.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? It's over.
Oh, first, I'm from Alabama too, and I think right now there are more people in this room from Alabama than the entire state. We lived in the best school district in Alabama and had to send our kids to private schools to get any exposure to diversity. And they went to private schools the entire time with a brief soiree. My son went to the public school. But Carolyn asked the question, what are the people doing in the communities and what is happening there? And Jerome, you said, people aren't responding enough. And Pam, you said, communities are not troubled enough to make the significant steps. When I look at the people in this room, They are overwhelmingly white, and they are participating in this conversation. My question is, are the people of color passionate enough about the separate and unequal issue to take the significant steps or to respond enough?
I think people, maybe I'm kind of challenging a little bit what I said earlier, but I think people are, but I think their voices don't get heard. Their voices don't get heard. A lot of people, even in terms of the scholarly community, the discourse, there was one, a lot of times, let me give you an example of this here. The ways in which Brown versus Board was being debated, talked about, or the way it became interpreted in terms of what was the desire for black people. We have a scholar named Charles Hamilton Houston. Before Thurgood Marshall, he was one of the founders of Howard University Law School. And one of the things he was pushing for was equal pay for black educators, equal pay for black schools. He was really trying to make Plessy become a reality. If white folks said, okay, separate but equal, he said, okay, make it equal then. But then there was a shift, so I would argue there are a lot of black educators, a lot of black people, in terms of how we started to understand, interpret Brown. Many of their voices were left out of the conversation, and it became interpreted wholly as an effort to pursue integrated education. There were a lot of black people who wanted to strengthen their schools and thought part and parcel of the solution should have included enhancing black schools during that time and not firing black teachers. And so what I'm saying is that black voices become, and that's why black lives do matter. Black voices become marginalized. And so even in terms of the scholarly community, I don't participate in a lot of forums. You heard my perspective, right? But I don't get invited to that many forums to bring a perspective that challenges what we think. That's why I said it's the continuous segregation. Just like black parents their voices don't become heard, and black teachers' voices don't become heard. So what I'm saying is that there are people who are upset, there are scholars, but they don't have the platform for the most part. And so there are little private meetings that are occurring all the time. In many ways, it's been like, when you think about having these various views, there has not been one-dimensional view. A scholar named Jack Doherty has talked about that in his work, that black people didn't embrace just one view. So there are some black people who are thinking, who don't want integration at all. There are some black people who really are radical about integration. And there are some black people who say, we're going to create separate schools, African-centered schools, because we have to deal with the cultural issues too. Because as you strive for some semblance of quality education, you still want to maintain your identity as a black person in that process. So there are myriad ways in which people are trying to resist, but they don't become placed in the newspapers. Now, you might find them in some black publications here and there, the few you can find.
Thank you for that question.
I know I'm the moderator, and this is not my role, but I just really need to respond to that because, you know, one of the things that we see happening now is that black folks are getting tired because they have been promised integration and it never really came, even when schools desegregated, as Jerome talked about. So I think what's happening in some segments of the black community is this sense that Jerome was mentioning, where people are like, look, if we can't have integration, if we can't have separate and equal, just give us, if we can't have separate and equal, no. If we can't have integrated, if we can't have, no.
If you have to have separate,
give us separate and equal, just because people are getting tired. And I will say this, so much of what we're seeing, and this was Erica's point about seeing schools as a public good and not just a private good, is that when we are making decisions about where to send our children to school, lots of white parents are making choices about the individual their individual benefits for education. What are they going to get? And so they look for the best schools for their children, and they don't stay in those neighborhood schools and fight for everybody's children to get the best education. So it's not just on black families to be doing the work. As Jerome said, their voices are not getting heard. White parents with the power are using their resources to move out of districts rather than staying there and fighting for everybody to get better schools. And as they do that and they leave with their resources, that's how we end up with these schools that are high poverty, high minority, and that no one really cares about. So we need to have a concerted effort for everybody to be invested in public education, and not just blacks, who I think also feel that they've carried much of the burden of desegregation along the way.
And Melinda, I know you're...
Thank you, moderator.
I want to add to that, too, because we have seen blacks historically bear the burden of desegregation. The miles bus for blacks are always more than whites. So historically, that's a legacy we have. When you look at public opinion polling, blacks are still the most supportive group of any group for school desegregation. That doesn't mean they don't have other things they value, too. I mean, we're all complex individuals. But black support for desegregation is the highest. And the third point that Carolyn ended on, I really think it's important to underline. Given the way in which segregation and inequality exists right now, it is not going to change on a systematic basis unless whites change their behavior. And so the burden has to be on whites to not run away from diversifying spaces, to not create boundaries or choices or all these mechanisms that have been created over the last 20 to 30 years that are going to be really impossible to address from a legal perspective. We have to challenge the framing of schooling and race neutrality if we're going to see any systematic change. And it can only be done in large part by whites.
Thank you. I think we have one more time for one more question, then we've got a Twitter question that I'm burning to ask.
That might be my Twitter question.
Maybe.
But I'm a public school teacher currently and also working on my MSA here at UNC, so I'm here with my cohort. We're aspiring, trying to become school leaders and beyond, but my question is, what are some things that we, or me as a teacher, how can I prevent this within my classroom, within my school, and how can we do that as school leaders in the next few years? How can we prevent this?
Thank you. That was my Twitter question.
I think it's imperative that educators, those who are going through colleges or schools of education and becoming prepared to become educators, are aware of the politics of schooling. That, have you taken a course like the social context or the social foundations of education?
So that's why we're here.
Okay, all right. Right.
For that class currently,
Right.
yeah.
Increasingly, though, I see colleges of education, they don't like those courses sometimes. So we do need to make sure that we're encouraging these schools of education to include these courses for the undergraduate students, that allow them the opportunity to think about what is the purpose of schooling, period. You know, is it about just becoming educated, or is it about the public? Right. And also understanding the history, how race became entrenched in that conversation around public schooling. So certain courses like social justice courses, if you have opportunity or space in your program, making sure you take those kind of courses. Sometimes people already have these prescribed programs. They don't have room for anything. Right. And so courses like even maybe that deals with the sociology of race, maybe taking a course, making sure you have something like that, or the politics of race. And also, sometimes people go through programs, they end up wanting to go back and teach in a school that I grew up in, a similar type of school in which I'm familiar with. So ensuring that these teacher education programs have placement opportunities for young people to get a sense of what they're going to experience, so that they don't come back 10 years later saying, I wish I would have been taught this. And so I commend you. I'm glad your class is here, and great job with that. I'm glad you came to this session so you can hear something that you won't get taught in schools.
Right.
So this is education right now. This is the extension of your classroom.
Yes.
And you get an A.
Well, I also want to thank the School of Education for its tremendous support and y'all being here. Indeed, that sums up our center's mission, is to give you the education you're not getting in school.
Right.
That's why we exist. Thank you all so much. Thank you again to our panelists and our moderator and to the Friday Center. We're so grateful for you all. Continue to follow us on Twitter. Our website is south.unc.edu to check out further programs around this topic and others. Thank you all.